Welcome to a bonus episode of the 3% podcast. This is Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and I'm joined today by Becky Crook, one of the translators from Norwegian literature, who's joining us to talk during Norwegian Month here on 3%. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Good morning for you. Thanks for coming on here. I know that you've got an incredibly busy schedule, and you mentioned right beforehand that this is the time for you to work on your own writing instead of your translating. So thanks for taking a few minutes to talk to me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Yeah, so I guess there's a bunch of stuff that we can kind of cover and go over related to projects you've worked on in your career. But I guess the first thing that I'm interested in is how did you said you had a funny story about how you got into Norwegian literature?
Yes. So, the way I like to frame it is it all comes down to a pair of crazy pants. So,
Okay.
and if anyone is familiar with the Norwegian curling team, the Norwegian Olympic curling team has their own fan page, or just for their pants.
Oh my God.
And so Norwegians, they do crazy pants really well. And when I was in junior high, there was a girl from Norway who was an exchange student who was in my band class, and she was wearing this extremely crazy pair of pants. And I had to get to know her because of her pants. So I went over and introduced myself to her. And this relationship ended up leading to me being an exchange student many years later in her country with her family and her her uncle and aunt, who are literature and language professors in Bergen, wrote a curriculum for me to learn Norwegian through reading classic Norwegian literature, which I think is why I'm a Norwegian translator today. But it all boils down to a pair of crazy pants.
That's really interesting. So they give you the all this classic literature to read. What kind of books were you reading, or which authors?
I read Henrik Ibsen. I read almost all of his works: Tarjei Vesaas, Sigrid Undset, Amalie Skram, Bjørneboe, Bjørnsen Bjørneboe, or Bjørneboe Bjørnsen. I always forget. I read a lot of different Knut Hamsun. I think just all of the sort of classic Norwegian authors, and that's how I learned Norwegian when I was 16.
That seems like a pretty great way to learn a language. The Sigrid Undset was funny. When I was in Norway, we went to visit her museum and house. And beforehand, as we were being introduced to like Norwegian literature and the famous figures and leading up to that house, they mentioned that her first novel had opened with like such a shocking line of like, "Today I cheated on my husband," or something to that effect. And they're like, it was so shocking at the time, blah, blah, blah. And this must have been repeated like no fewer than 24 times over the next like 3 days. But then I heard that book's not even translated into English.
Oh, really? Yeah. See, I don't know which of her works have been translated. I think I started to look into it one time and then thought, well, surely all of her work must have already been translated.
Yeah, apparently that one has not. And then that led me down this like rabbit hole of thinking of like, I can see how that line would have been very shocking at the time and now isn't so shocking, but like makes sense. But like I couldn't figure out if there'd be an equivalent in 2019 that one could say that. It would be really hard to judge what the future is going to hold, but like what you would say now, that would be shocking that years later people would be like, "Oh, yeah, okay. I mean, I get it, but it's not so shocking anymore."
I just translated a book by Erling Kagge called Silence, and I think, funnily enough, silence is sort of the shocking thing in 2019.
It's true.
So, it was a big hit, this book.
I know. I was looking at that book. I really want to read that, actually.
Yeah. And he just came out with another one called Walking. And I think he's coming out with another one about sort of outdoor wilderness tips, he told me.
Interesting.
Yeah,
So tell us about those books, actually.
So Erling Kagge is a modern Norwegian polar explorer. He was the first human to set foot on all three poles, the third pole being Mount Everest.
Okay.
He skied alone to the South Pole, and he skied together with one other person to the North Pole, and then he climbed Everest. And he also owns a publishing company in Norway called Kagge Forlag.
Okay.
And he began to write a couple books about his expeditions and his thoughts on his expeditions. And he has a lot of philosophical thoughts. He reads a lot of philosophy, and he sort of combines it with his extreme experiences and tries to boil it down to what is essential in life. So silence is like 20 something reflections on the topic of silence, just sort of a random assortment of reflections based on his experience and on philosophy that he's read. And walking is very similar.
Ah, makes sense. Sounds really
Yeah.
cool. Both of those sound really
Mhm.
cool. So
Yeah.
how did you? So you learned Norwegian through all these classic authors, and then you ended up studying the language more seriously, I assume, and then ended up in wanting to be a translator.
Yeah, so I have a degree in linguistics. I actually focused on Russian,
Oh wow.
from which I do not translate. I never developed it far enough to be, I think, good enough to be a Russian translator.
Let me hold up for 1 second. So you have Norwegian, learn Russian. Your Skype address has you in Berlin, Germany, and your letter to me is from the Netherlands.
Correct.
Okay, just making
So,
sure.
so my husband is German, and I lived in Berlin for 7 years, where
Mhm.
I founded Sand Journal. It's a
Right.
literary arts magazine. And when I was living there, I learned German. So I also translate from German now. And then when when our daughter was born, we moved to the Netherlands, where my husband finished doing his PhD. And
Ah,
so we have recently moved back to the US. We live on an island just off the coast of Seattle.
very cool.
So, yes, several different languages, but I only translate from Norwegian and German.
Okay.
And in fact, I was hoping to be a therapist and a writer.
Wow.
But when I met my husband and moved to Berlin, I needed to be a little bit flexible with my career. So I just started to try to get into translation. And I focused on German, but it was quite difficult to get into the German translation market because there's so many translators. And finally, one day, a company called me up and said, "We see that you are fluent in Norwegian. We can't find any Norwegian translators. Can you come and do a job for us?" So after that, I flew to Oslo and started introducing myself to publishers there. And that's how I got into that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I know. I think the first time that we're in, and this might not be true because like the intro to your letter makes it seem like we talked before this point, which is possible. My memory is very
We did.
shaky.
We met in London, Chad. Don't you
Okay.
remember that?
God damn it. God damn it. Well, okay. So to be fair, that was before. That was more than 7 years ago.
Right. And there were thousands of other translators. They keep us at the London Book Fair, they keep all the translators in this little pen so that we feel safe.
It's true. That is true.
I met you inside of that little pen.
That's true. That this is coming back to me. That would have been in like 2012 was the last
Right.
time I went to London, I believe, into the book
Okay.
fair. And I was there for 2 days.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we met there and then we talked there. And then the next year, I guess, April 26, 2013, you sent us a letter pitching a book called The Black Signs. And your cover letter is one of the letters that we use as an example in classes and with other, like at Alta or any kind of professional situation where a translator is asking how to write a good cover letter. Yours is one of the examples that we use. For that, which to embarrass you fully, because I don't know that you know this.
No, you just told me that recently, and I was kind of shocked because The Black Signs is one of the first books that I translated, and I'm pretty sure that was one of the first cover letters I ever sent out.
Oh my God. Okay, so here's the things I think worked really well about it. It works really well with it
Yep.
that for anyone who's listening who's trying to figure out how to write a good cover letter,
And to remind me as well, so
and
I remember.
I was gonna send it back to you, but I thought it would be funnier if I read it to you or parts of it
Right,
to
go
you.
for it.
So you're welcome. So what you start out by referring to the book as like a Norwegian debut novel that isn't about suicide or death, but is rather a bizarre, pitch black, at times hilarious, at times repulsive account of the contemporary individual's search for a soul. So already the pitch black and hilarious and disturbing or repulsive are all good key words for me. But then you also say that you enclosed articles, a sample translation. At a different point in the chart, you mention enclosing a pie chart, which that's a plus. I'm I'm a
I
sucker for
always go for every
graphics.
opportunity to include a pie chart.
Yes, pie charts, Venn diagrams, any sort of like statistical representation, I'm in. But you mentioned that the other thing that's very eye catching at the start is that the author's name is what is his first name? Where is it? Oh, Lars Mørch
Lars,
Finbourd. Finbourd.
Lars Mørch Finbourd. It's okay.
Yeah, that one. That's close. Okay, there's another word that in this book that I cannot pronounce that you're gonna have to say. Um,
Okay.
but then you mentioned that came out in 2013, got a lot of praise for being original and refreshing, including a review in Aftenposten that's saying, "Is he fucking with us?" Which is, again, speaking to me and speaking my language. But then no, it's really important. So I want to read your description in a second. You mentioned the pie chart, but what's really important is that after the description, you mentioned how it's like a trove of information. It's got all these different pieces to it. It reminds you of Camus philosophizing with Umberto Eco's widely imaginative essays, is compared by one Norwegian journalist to Bolaño, but it also reminds you of our book, The Museum of Eterna's Novel by Macedonia Fernandez. And that's a key that we always talk to people about in writing these letters, is to like be able to refer to something that we've published or something that's in our realm to make it make sense. Now, in terms of the description, your description is perfect, because I was trying how I would describe this book. And basically what you wrote is the best description. And since I don't know that anyone listening has read The Black Signs, I'm going to just read your description, since I think it's better than I don't even know if there is. Oh yeah, the jacket copy is rough. I've got a few negative things to say about the production of this book in a minute, but I'm sorry. This is all over the place.
I didn't produce it. It's okay.
I know. Okay. This is going to shock you. Okay, so the two-part novel opens somewhat slowly with the discovery by a lawyer sent to inventory the estate of a deceased grandmother and her mysteriously disappeared grandchild of millions of black signs outlining gloomy histories, a book full of unsent letters by the missing grandchild to a person named Gustamoldo, and a meticulously detailed catalog of auctioned-off celebrity relics, which the author labels
Eutanask.
Part 2 of the book is comprised solely of the letters to Dear Gustamoldo, in which, between philosophical discussions about the nature of art, graveyards of the world, biographical information about grandmother, and longing for a missing friend, the letter writer discusses his and Gustamoldo's master plan of auctioning off grandmother's extensive Jutanask?
Yeah, you can say that.
Okay, Hutanask, whatever, I was close. Collection to finance their production of an alternative, trivial form of history in the shape of the Black Signs, with which they plan to cover Oslo and eventually the entire world, which is essentially the book itself. There's a really good description of it. So then you go on and talk about the fascinating information that's in there and the author's background and why you're so excited about doing it, and that on a topical level, it's pushing a lot of limits of like form and the definition of art and society that values every piece of output by individuals as something special and unique, tying it all into what we've done. So like your in knowledge of the press mixed with a way of pitching this book that makes it sound both interesting and compelling and unique is kind of why this letter works so well.
Good. Well, that makes me happy.
Good. And I think it's incredibly funny. Like I was laughing out loud reading this last night.
The book or the letter?
The book.
Yeah. The book is very, very strange and unusual, and hilarious, I think, in some ways. Yeah.
It is absolutely. So here's the thing that shocks me. So coming in, I didn't know this until just now, but like getting ready to interview, I had a feeling that this is the sort of book that a lot of like the translation booksellers and that community and the Twitter translation community should really, really love. Like it's got humor, it's philosophical and interesting, it's unique in a lot of ways. The voice is really strong, it's really fun, and I'm surprised that it didn't. I didn't hear a lot of people talk about it among that group, but if they knew about it, I think that they would. And I had a feeling that this podcast will ignite a bunch of people to go get this book, or at least a number of them. It's not available through Ingram anymore, and it's listed as being literary criticism.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's the part that I was like clicked on this and I was like, wait a second, that's not right.
Yeah, that's a little bit obscure. I think that it's a book that I was glad that Broken Dimanche Press took a chance with it.
Yeah.
Because it is that kind of book that I wish would get more attention. In how unusual it is.
Yeah.
But I just think it's, a lot of publishers, they don't want something that strange. And I also think that in Norway, it's not really like the kind of literature that the mainstream publishers are sort of pushing to the international community.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's a little bit too odd, They don't think that anyone might be interested, or a huge audience might be interested in reading it.
Right.
So
I agree. It's unfortunate because you know who it reminds me of. So you mentioned a few people in here that reminds you. Have you ever heard of the author Lars Eier?
No.
He wrote this trilogy called, or I think it was called the Spurious trilogy, but it's Spurious, Dogma, and Exodus. and it's just a
Mhm.
series of conversations between these two like bumbling, hapless, kind of perennial PhD student philosophers, quasi philosophers, that
Uh-huh.
their main hobby and what they like to do is like talk a lot of like about nihilism or about these thoughts about the world, but then just draw penises on papers and like just they're like very undercutting like the idea of like this grand philosophy. And there's a bit of like the voice that reminded me of in here in the Black Science reminded me of the Eyre books because it's kind of like that high, very high, like here's a philosophical idea about like positive nihilism, and then undercut by like just this random pop culture information or this like this absurdity of this idea that the grandmother who's collected all this like
Right.
artistic detritus is lived to be 108 and at 4 years old was like drinking booze with like all these artists and out talking them because she was so smart and like it's all clearly like this mythologizing and myth making sort of persona, and that
Yeah.
sort of fits in well with the Lars Eyre books too.
Okay. Yeah, I love that kind of absurdity in literature personally. I wish there was more of it that I could translate.
Yeah. It's super fun because it really feels like it's so contingent upon the voice too.
Yes. Yeah, and I think I can't remember, but I think that I remember Lars talking to me about possibly writing a book from the Gustamaldo character,
Oh,
his voice, but I don't remember if that's true or if I just hallucinated that, possibly.
that'd
I'll
be
have to
really
ask
funny.
him. So he also came out with another book that I translated called Sanding Down Gravestones.
Oh,
It's a book of essays on Norwegian music history.
wow.
um, I would say music and sound history, and they're these very short essays, also just super interesting and very well written and very obscure at the same time. Um, so I would recommend that book actually, and that was a later project, and I think that my translation skills had improved a lot, or they were even better than they were with the black signs.
There you go. That's a much better way of putting it.
That's my pitch.
So that's something that you mentioned in the email and that I really wanted to get into as much as you're comfortable or capable of. How would you define that? Like, it's one of those things that like I feel like we all kind of can recognize as we improve at a particular skill, and writing and translating are both skills that have that where you feel like you are doing better, but it's hard sometimes to point to specifically what that is
Yeah.
maybe. And I wonder how much of it, like if you looked back at this, what you think you would have done differently nowadays, or just general ideas about like what you're more comfortable with as a translator, however many years later, 6 years later, and having had published now like upwards of 20 some titles.
Mhm.
That experience has obviously like added to your knowledge and your way of approaching the book. But do you have any specific ideas of what you would have changed?
I think I would have paid attention a little bit more to, or just paid attention a little bit more to my own confidence as a writer.
Yeah.
Um, I That was my first book that I translated, The Black Signs, and I would just like to make clear I never went through a translation program, so
Hmm.
I'm not a certified translator. I studied linguistics, but not translation.
Yeah.
And so I didn't really have the formal training to know sort of techniques in translation. Although I do consider myself a writer and I have written for many years. I think that when I went into translation, I didn't look at it as using necessarily my skills, my voice as a writer to kind of use that in the translation. And I was just kind of translating words one for one in a sense, or sentences. And so I believe, and I haven't looked at it for a while, but I think that the black signs probably comes out a little bit stiff
Right.
in English because of that. Like you might be able to tell in a lot of places that it is a translation and it might not sound quite as natural.
Hmm.
So now what I do, and of course you have to carry the author's tone
Yeah.
into the English. You can't just make it totally your own story.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think I feel a lot more confident now, even though I've had a lot of setbacks in my translation career too. I should be honest about that. Like I've had people fire me and or I've had to change translations. I think probably a lot of people have something similar to happen to them along their
Yeah.
way. But I hope that I'm continuing to learn and just grow into being confident with the choices that I make as long as they're deliberate and thoughtful and there's something behind it. And that is just the choice that a translator has, and owning that a little bit more instead of, just sort of bending over to what other people might want.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I don't think that it's necessarily stiff per se. I wouldn't say that as a criticism of it. But I feel like I bet if you went back through this, the voice you would refine to a point that would be really perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's moments where like that humor is so specific with the kind of elevation of tone, or like the register shifts, and like the way that it's kind of, because it is so absurd, and it's almost like the other thing that came to mind was Pale Fire, where you're like, I know this person's batshit, but I don't know like the scope or shape of their batshittiness quite
Mm-hmm.
yet. And it has that kind of feel to it. And I think that's something I was wondering about. Like if you had gone back, that would be exactly what I would have thought of too.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, and I met with Lars several years later when I was working on the translation of his essays on music. And it was so sweet. He and his partner were in Berlin, where he was spending a month writing, and I was currently living in Berlin. And we met, and he said, I think you've improved a lot as a translator. And at the time, I didn't think that I needed to improve as a translator, and so I was kind of taken aback. And but I think that was a really good, moment of like, oh yeah, I think there's always room for improvement.
Yeah, of course. And it is like what you say, the confidence. That's one of those things I think is a real distinguishing mark between someone first starting out and someone who is advanced or at the point where they're like professional. Like I work with students. There's a lot of like tentativeness, a lot of what you're saying of like the word for word action, and also just a stiffness that comes from like I don't know if it's like a deep, like a inherent fear of like saying the wrong thing or doing something wrong with the translation, or just like an unawareness of how to write, because some of the translators we work with aren't writers. They're just,
Right.
readers or linguists or whatever, and then want to do translation and don't necessarily know those tricks that writers know of how to convey something in English that might not have been conveyed the same way in the other language. But then you see people like a couple years on or a couple projects on that have like got it, and you can tell right away that there's like the text feels so confident and feels so, as you read it, that you trust the translation and the translator so much that a lot of things that might have been questions in a different context are no longer questions. Like there's none of those moments where you're like, oh, this sounds like a translation. If someone has the right confidence and is able to convey that through their writing style, those things start to become like interesting choices. Now,
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
oh
Go
no,
ahead.
and that's just one of those things I always try and convey to people.
Yeah, I think it's the confidence, just sort of taking those decisions, but it also has a lot, in my experience, to do with the relationship that you have with the author.
Hmm.
And Norwegians tend to have a very strong command of English, and so they maybe, if you're translating into a different language, or from a different language, they have a lot to say, a lot of input into their translations. And some of them are very hands-on, and some of them are just sort of more trusting of what you do. So I think there's always that relationship plays into how confident I sometimes tend to be in my translations too. For example, the book that you're going to be reviewing soon, called Monsterhuman by
Oh yeah.
Kjersti Stensvold. That book, I would say I felt that my skills were much better at that point when I started translating it.
Hmm.
But there were certain things that the author really had a lot of input on, very specific, like, no, I want this word or this word or that word.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and she was very, very hands-on in her book, and I think, and that's totally fine, of course, that it's her writing. But it was also a funny book to translate because the main character is she often mistakes words. Like she often
Right.
says the wrong word in the book, and then people around her don't understand what she's saying. And so catching all of those instances, because it's not really obvious in the book, she'll just say, my tree hurts. And instead of my knee hurts, and she'll just say things like that. And so sometimes my brain would just sort of switch it in the sentence and I would
Oh
miss it.
yeah.
And that happened all the time in that book. And So I felt like I had to be really cautious when I was translating that book, just to be sure I got everything, didn't miss anything. It was a little bit scary experience sometimes.
Yeah, I can imagine. So like, yeah, so like finding or like inserting intentional word, not even beyond wordplay, but like error, what seems like an error. And it is
Right.
supposed to be an error, I guess.
Yeah. And her character does it all the time, and you never know when it is. And sometimes it just kind of happens with no commentary.
Wow.
And I think it's confusing. It's supposed to be confusing for the reader. But as a translator, sometimes I got confused and didn't know if it was supposed to be confusing or it was just a typo.
That's gonna be fun to read. That's gonna be so yeah. So you mentioned we're starting in a few weeks. The next season of the 2 month review will be all about Monsterhuman and will last through the end of September. As we read it like 45 pages a week for like 10 episodes. So
Wow.
everyone should get a copy of the book. Listen in, tune in, subscribe to the 2 month review. It airs on Tuesday, usually on Wednesday mornings on YouTube, and then Thursday morning the podcast version is available. But all that information is on 3%. And hopefully, if you're listening to this, you're sort of familiar with the 2 month review rigmarole. But order a copy of the book as soon as you hear this, so that you can be sure to get one. And it should be available from any bookseller should be able to order it, and it's available from any retailer that you would prefer to use. So how did Monsterhuman come about? Well, actually, I want to go back for 1 second just to give people one last pitch for the Black Signs. So in the midst of this guy's narrative about like writing to his friend about their ideas for all these black signs, that would be about like the little dark histories of individuals and bad things that had happened to them, to kind of counteract those kind of blue signs of like important places or of landmarks. They want to sell off all these like art, I don't know what you call art objects, that his grandmother has collected. And so the book shifts between these letters that are like all over the place, telling little stories about their childhood and about the grandmother's life, and they're all very like feel very myth making and like not necessarily realistic in any way. And then it'll have these interjected pages of some of the things that they're selling off. And I just want to read two of them that I think will give people a sense of like what this book's humor is. So there's one that they're selling off, letter from George Bataille, 1961. 2-page long handwritten letter containing an outburst against Foucault and his madness and civilization. His closing remarks state that son of an ape looks like a cross between Yul Brynner and a dildo with legs. And then it describes this A4 page of paper is JG0033 because they're chronicling everything that they're selling. And then the last one is Snoop Dogg's hot dog napkin, 2008. Grandma took the napkin when Kelvin Cortazar Brodius, aka Snoop Dogg, launched his new brand, Doggy Snacks. Among other products, he unveiled a foot-long hot dog, the Snoop Hot Dog, for which Grandma was flown in as a witness and to lend an air of cultural gravity to the event. Brodius burst into tears when Grandma called Doggy Snacks the most beautiful thing to happen to African-American cultural life since Charles Burnett's neo-realistic blaxploitation film Killer of Sheep. Cotton. So it's just a napkin with this story attached. It reminds me a bit of the Museum of Jurassic Technology too, where it's like kind of half invented museum artifacts. But it's wonderful. I think the book's really fun. I think if anyone can get a hold of it, I think listeners of this would really enjoy it, because it is that vocally driven, voice driven sort of book with a lot of humor in it. It's not super long either. So Monsterhuman, how did this come about?
You mean my role in it?
Yes.
Yes. So I met John O'Brien from Dalkey when I was in at the London Book Fair one year, and then he sent me an email and asked me to translate it. And it was a long book. It's like a 600-page book, and so I translated it over the next year. And then I needed a team of editors to help me find the places where I had overlooked. Not really a team of editors. I used one editor to kind of comb through and just make sure that there weren't any more places that I had sort of overlooked these intentional mistakes that had been left throughout the book.
Right.
And then and then we finished it up, and it was published, I think, 2 years ago.
I think that's right. Yeah, 2017.
Yeah, it was a long book and a long process, but I'm very happy with how it turned out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad that it's available. How would you describe this book to anyone who's considering joining us on this long reading journey?
Um, I think it's an account. It's sort of in the genre. I'm not sure what you call that genre. It's like autobiographical fiction.
Yeah, like autofiction.
Autofiction, okay. It's in that genre, which I think was made really popular by Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggle.
Yeah.
It's kind of coming out of that genre from the perspective of Kjersti Skomsvold, who, as a young woman, she had to quit her studies to become an engineer, and because she had um, chronic fatigue syndrome, she was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, and she lost many years to this illness where she just couldn't do anything but lie in a room, where walking to the mailbox was a chore. As a young person in her 20s, it was sort of a devastating time for her. And during that period, she began to she got an idea for a story,
Hmm.
and she began to write down her ideas on post-it notes. And over a period of, I don't know, 2 to 5 years, she ended up putting together this short novel, which she actually went on to publish. And this is true. And this book, Monsterhuman, is sort of about the process of becoming a writer during that period of her life. So she kind of, I would say it's sort of fictionalized because she sort of cuts, edits the amount of time here and there, or
Right.
combines characters, or does this or that. And she sort of talks about doing that. And then she switches between past, present, future tenses. She switches between perspectives of who's telling the story in terms of if it's third person or first person.
Yeah.
And she sort of goes on different, she has different kind of philosophical reflections, and she talks a lot about what it means to be human. And, and in that time, she's also going through relationship changes and her body. It's a very in-depth exploration of illness, and also writing one's first book, I would say.
That's really cool. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to like getting into it because I've read part of it before, but not the entire thing. So it'll be fun to actually read the entire book. I read her first book that got translated, the Faster I Walk, Smaller I Am.
Yes,
Is that
and that
right?
is the book that she wrote while she was
Okay.
facing this illness. And now she's recently come out with another book about being a mother for the first time. It's called The Child, I believe.
Right, which is, are you translating that?
No, that's being translated, I believe, by Martin
Martin.
Aitken.
That's correct. I do remember this now because it's being translated and published in the UK. I don't think they have a US publisher yet.
No, no.
But I
She
think
has
they
a
will.
very strong voice.
Hmm.
I think you'll like it. So I'm very curious to hear what you think about it. But I so much enjoyed translating her writing, even though it was confusing at times, because she's just such a good writer. Her descriptions, sometimes they just leave you breathless, I
That's really
felt.
cool. That's very
Mhm.
cool. So, I have to shift gears too much from the books, but as a translator that's done a lot of projects, is there advice that you would have for translators starting out now? And specifically, like I always go to Translation Breadloaf and have to do a whole presentation about contracts and
Mhm.
royalties and stuff like that. And I wonder if you had any insights that you would like to share
Yeah,
with young translators.
I would be happy to. Possibly because I didn't go through a translation program, I feel like I had to learn the hard way when it comes to contracts. I think that in my experience, you should always have a very tight contract. You can have the Authors Guild, or there's a version in Britain that looks over contracts. They have lawyers to do that. You should make sure that you have part of the payment up front before you start anything, because I've had at least one experience where after translating a book, the publisher ran out of money and just decided not to pay me.
Yeah. Oh boy.
You don't want to run into that issue. You don't want to, I think you need to be careful about any royalties or checking. I mean, not all publishers offer that. You just need to try to get a good deal.
Hmm.
You also need to look at, I really appreciate contracts that sort of lay out what happens in case anyone is unhappy.
Right.
not because I assume that somebody's going to be unhappy, but because it's just really clear what happens if anyone claims this or that. You
We
just want
actually
to,
have that in our contract.
yeah, it's just something
Yeah.
short. I always like to say, if you're not happy with something, I like it if they say, oh, you have 2 weeks to sort of see if there's anything that can be done. I like things that are clear.
Hmm.
I think as a young translator, I just signed whatever because I wanted to get a job.
Right.
But you can really get into trouble especially, I don't want to say that there's a lot of publishers who are exploitative to translators, but there are some, and where the translator isn't really valued, I feel, and you just need to just be safe about it and get a good contract. And if you're not sure what a good contract is, then just have one of these translator organizations look over it, and they'll tell you.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. That's all very good advice.
yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add to that, or any other advice that's non-contract related?
Um, you know, it's hard because I have my experience getting into translation as an American of Norwegian literature, where most of the Norwegian translators into English are British or Scottish.
That's
And
true.
so, yeah, so my experience with that, and especially since we moved back to the US, is that attending conferences and book fairs where in your country, or as much as you can, is a good opportunity to just get your name out there and get people to remember you, especially if you're new and you don't have a lot of inquiries. And just introduce yourself to a lot of people and be willing to work really hard the first few years. Another thing that I do, which has been sort of my strategy, but it's also because as the founder of Sand Journal, I really value independent literary arts magazines, is that from time to time, I take extra time just to translate short stories
Right.
and to submit them around to literary magazines. Now, that's not something that a lot of translators feel they have time to do or want to do, but I just love that genre, and I love having things published in magazines. So, but I think that that may help also get your name out there. I'm
Yeah.
not sure. Yeah.
I think so too, for sure.
And what I love to do, what I love about it is that it gives me an opportunity to work on authors who usually work with a one translator, or who tend to have
Um,
sort of their fixed translators. So, for example, I've gotten to translate a couple pieces by Dag Solstad, whose work I just love.
uh-huh.
Um, I've gotten to translate some short pieces by him for magazines, even though he tends to work with the same translator.
Yeah, yeah. That makes sense. That's really, yeah, and that's really a great experience for the translator, and also to get your name out there, obviously.
Right. And it helps me to just sort of hone my craft and to get the experience of sort of translating these different voices by great writers.
Right, right.
Yeah. Which
That's really,
is,
and there are more and more journals,
journal.
both online and in print, that are doing translations nowadays.
Mhm.
So it's a lot easier, I think, to like find someone who would be interested, or at least be able to pitch your stuff.
Right. Right.
So I just have one last question for you. Is there any way that you'd categorize like what's going on today in contemporary Norwegian literature? And I guess as a second part, is there a dream project that you want to translate that no one's picked up on yet?
Oh gosh.
I guess that's really two separate questions.
It is. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on contemporary Norwegian literature because
Okay.
I just don't have the time to read as many books that I would like to.
Hmm.
I was talking the other day with an editor about um, how there is a lot of autofiction coming out of Norway,
Oh yeah.
especially since Knausgaard's books, and how this is. It kind of makes sense. Norway has this very high standard of living. People live very privileged lives, and I think it sort of lends itself to this kind of just over reflection, like sort of this is sort of reflection or gazing inward on their lives and dramas and problems.
Yeah.
But unless you're a really good writer, I feel like it's hard to sort of pull that off in a way that's interesting. And I'm looking for more like plot driven type of novels personally, or really bizarre or absurd type of things.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and I and maybe I'm wrong. I could be very wrong about this, but I don't. I find it's hard for me to find those pieces which don't already have a translator attached to them, coming out of Norway. That said, there are some really exciting writers in Norway that I love Dag Solstad. I love
Hmm.
Per Pedersen. I really like Mona Høvring. I love Agnes Ravaten and um, oh gosh, Hanne Østervik. And there is a dream project that I would love to work on, and
Okay.
it's by Britt Bildoen. She's the one whose book 7 Days in August I translated.
Okay.
Um, but she has two books that have recently come out, and one of the most recent one is called Three Roads to the Sea, and it's sort of goes back and forth between the bureaucracy and then the very real lives of people involved in trying to adopt a child from overseas and then being
Oh, wow.
denied because they're too old. And
Wow.
it's a beautiful book, and I think it's a very important topic. That is not necessarily my dream project. My dream project is her other book, which came out several years ago, and which I feel like somehow has totally missed the attention of people. And I think it's a brilliant book. The Norwegian title is called Arna Hjort's Road. It would need a different title, but it's basically a modern environmental retelling of Don Quixote,
Whoa.
uh, where it follows this kind of old school environmentalist um, on his bicycle across Western Norway, sort of evangelizing at town hall meetings. And along the way, all of these mythical things happen. And he is followed by a very reluctant documentary filmmaker who also is like forced to ride a bike, and he doesn't want to be on the bike, but he like the guy, that's the only way he'll agree to let him come. And so this guy is like grunting as he follows this environmentalist on their bicycles over the mountains in Norway from town to town, where they like get chased by dogs, they have rocks thrown at them, they like almost die inside of a magical lake, like they have all these adventures, they meet death in his entourage on the road. Like it's just spectacular. It's like I read it on a flight from Seattle to New York, and I was laughing out loud almost the whole time. And Britt Bildoen is just so masterful in changing her tone and her language to each book that she writes. And I think this book is a masterpiece, and I really wish that somebody would pick up on it.
Dude, okay, so let's talk outside of this because that sounds right up my alley. There's a book that we have called Thrown into Nature.
Mhm.
That's by Milan Ruskov. Yeah, that's right. And he is a Bulgarian book that we did, and it's basically like it sounds semi similar in which like this person's going along with this famous doctor whose only prescription is smoke. He believes that smoking can cure anything, and that you can ingest smoke in all sorts of different ways. And so he
Sure.
goes throughout Spain like evangelizing about smoke and it has all these crazy adventures, very Quixote like. So
Okay.
this is like that sounds really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it's hard to capture it in a sample translation. I
Yeah.
think it's hard to capture what's going on in her book, because it's a long book. That may be one of the things that's turned publishers off to it, is the length of the book. But I think it's brilliant, and I would love to do it. And I am just going to throw in one other short
Yeah.
thing, which is that there is a Dag Solstad book about him just walking around Berlin,
Oh.
which publishers and his agents don't seem to think that anyone's going to be interested in translating or publishing. And it's like my dream Berlin-based book because I lived in Berlin, and Dag Solstad also has an apartment in Berlin, and I just think it's brilliant. And I would like in my dreams some kind of like Berlin-based um, publisher would have it translated into English and German, because I think it's fascinating. He just basically walks around Berlin and talks about his thoughts, and like is kind of disgruntled because he refuses to learn German, which is so Dag Solstad actually.
That's I mean that seems like one I know there's various points in time that we've looked into his books before, but with everyone doing or with New Directions doing the bunch of them, like
Right.
I sort of like backed off. But like are they would be up their alley. I mean they do all the Robert Balser books, which are lots of walking.
Yes, I have talked to him about that, but I think it's like I think a lot of people are not quite sure about the interest, the Berlin interest. So I'm not sure. And it's long, and I need to have time to actually just do a long sample for them.
Oh yeah.
For
Yeah.
anyone. But this is another book that in my dreams I would also translate.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
That does sound very interesting. Both those sound great. It's weird. Like I'll have all the statistics. We're recording this prior to it coming out. But by the time that this is released and people are listening to it, I'm gonna have all these stats on like how Norway ranks against other Scandinavian nations and all sorts of information in the opening July post that I prepared for a trip to Lillehammer and am updating right now. But it seems like Norway is sort of primed for like a good moment. I mean, there's a weird. I get in this too much, but like there have been a number of books that are translated from Norwegian and published in English. However, a majority of them, or not a majority, but the largest publisher of them has been Delki, especially of literature, leaving out all the crime novels. And I think that that's going to shift over the next few years, and a lot of these authors are going to be picked up by other presses, independent, nonprofit, or large presses. And I think there's going to be like a sudden great interest and resurgence of interest in Norway.
Yeah, I think they're really pouring a lot into promoting Norwegian literature abroad,
Yeah,
especially leading up to the Frankfurt Book Fair
exactly.
with Guest of Honor this year.
And that will make a huge difference. Being guest of honor makes a huge difference. All the books being available, like so many books get translated into German, which is a language that a lot more editors read than Norwegian, for better or worse. And that will make a big difference. And I think that there's going to be a bunch of stuff coming out over the next few years. The fact that Knausgård was popular doesn't hurt, but I don't know that that's actually going to be the main reason why people become more interested in Norwegian lit.
Yeah, no, I think there is a huge interest in a lot of authors who may have gone a bit under the radar
Yeah,
at these big book festivals, and that is really exciting to see because there are some really great Norwegian writers who are not like among the top 5 best-selling authors abroad, who I think deserve more attention.
absolutely. I completely agree.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for doing this.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me.
It's a lot of fun to talk about this, and hopefully you'll come back towards the end of our Monsterhuman 2-month review and tell us about all the ways that we were wrong and/or answer any crazy questions that we have.
Yeah,
Because talking about a book an hour a week for 10 weeks becomes a little. It can get a little odd at times.
all right. Well, no, I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
They're always pretty fun. Well, cool. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure I'll talk to you again soon.
Okay.